Hello, everybody. Today, our keynote speaker is a leader in the industry who will guide us on how businesses can transform through the most relevant secure access service edge technology. We have with us Mr. Sunil David presenting the topic, The Future of Cloud and Network Security. What does SASE bring to the table? He is the Regional Director of IoT, India and ASEAN, AT&T Global Network Services India Private Limited. He is responsible for building the IoT strategy for the India and ASEAN regions. After dedicating 27 years for building IoT strategy, he was honored with an award for excellence and leadership in the IT and Telecom Industry in June 2021, bestowed with the Indian Achievers Award in 2021. India's fastest growing leaders 2019-2020, Pride of the Nation in February 2021, and has many other achievements to his credit. I can go on with a long list, but now I leave the stage to him. Welcome, Mr. Sunil David.
Thank you, Sumi, for that introduction. Firstly, can you all hear me clearly and can you all see my screen?
Yes, Mr. Sunil, we can.
Okay, so at the outset, I would like to thank the Rocheston team for inviting me to deliver this keynote on a very, very pertinent topic. And the topic for today is the future of cloud and network security. And what does SASE bring to the table? SASE is a framework which I'm going to cover during the presentation. Now, as far as the agenda for my presentation is concerned, firstly, I would want to talk about some of the cyber risks that are continuing to evolve. What are the global factors that are currently at play today? And then get to the real meat, what is SASE? Why is it a buzzword in 2021? The whole framework around SASE and what are the drivers for SASE? And then I would talk about the network of the future, touch a little bit about cloud security, and then I would conclude. Now, looking at the cyber risks today, so if you just looked at in the past, the attack surface was kind of confined to PC LAN environments, client servers, and then your adversaries were largely the hobbyist hackers, who were hacking for fun. And there were threats mainly coming from viruses and worms. Of course, in the last 10 years, and even now, the threat surface or the attack surface has widened considerably. So today, the attack surface is your web, your mobile endpoints. All of us are using your mobile assets to connect to our enterprise applications. And of course, cloud, where a lot of our applications are hosted. So the attack surface has widened significantly today. The other thing is that the adversaries also, the bad guys, they are not just doing it for financial motivation, but there are also these activists who are also wanting to do this for society, social and political gains. And then, of course, nation states, one nation attacking the other. You would have just recently read about how the US had actually threatened China and Russia as to why they are constantly hacking into the government systems of the US. As far as the threats are concerned, we have, we've seen, especially in the last 16, 17 months, ever since the pandemic has hit us, we've seen a number of DDoS attacks, phishing attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, SQL injection, ransomware, significant attacks on ransomware, and the threats are only getting much more complex. Now, what's going to happen tomorrow? Right. So tomorrow, what's going to happen is that the whole architecture of networks are going to change. If you talk from an enterprise standpoint, we're going to see a lot more adoption of what I call edge. So very briefly, what edge is that today, when you have a large enterprise and when they are connecting to their applications on the cloud, they might be using any means of transport to connect to the application on the cloud. Now, when you connect applications, when you're connecting to applications on the cloud, of course, there is a latency involved, the time it takes for a packet to go to the cloud and come back. Now we're seeing a lot more enterprises wanting to have edge devices where you're storing all of the applications data closer to where the data is getting generated, closer to where the enterprise is, somewhere between the cloud and the enterprise. And so the attack surface next going forward will be on the edge. The other thing is this whole frictionless commercialized cybercrime, So today you find people, the hackers actually advertising about their services on the dark web. The threats are going to get even more stronger going forward. Today, while you can use AI for predicting potential cyber attacks, the hackers can also use AI technology, right? So AI, of course, can be used for good and bad, but there is a possibility that the hackers might use AI. The cyber attacks can also cause physical harm, and that is a real threat because, especially industrial assets, if you're able to attack industrial assets, and we've seen a number of industrial assets getting attacked over the last couple of years. In fact, this year alone, we had two big, large auto OEMs. Their factories were hacked. Today, you have these drones which are IoT enabled. You can actually hack a drone, and that can actually cause physical harm. So these threats are all real. Now, what are the challenges that one might face going forward? So one, I think the need to maintain proper security posture. And what I mean by that is that the enterprise should collect as much information as possible about the current state of network infra and the communications and use it to improve their security posture, the ability to handle any threat that might come their way. The extending of the security policy to new types of devices, because today, it's just not your PCs, laptops, your mobile assets. Thanks to IoT, Internet of Things, there are a lot more assets which are now connecting to the internet, right? So you have cars which are connected, machines which are connected, right? So pretty much every physical asset today can be connected to the internet. And every physical asset, when you're connecting to the internet, you'll have an IP address for that asset. And when you have an IP address for a specific asset, it becomes potentially hackable. The need to implement zero trust framework, I'm going to touch upon it later. The accessing and moving higher quantities of data, right? So humongous amount of data is being generated. I think studies have proven that the amount of data that has been generated over the last 5 years is much more than what was generated maybe in the previous 20 years. And the handling bursts of workloads, right? So the sudden bursts of workload which comes. So how do you handle that? So these are typical challenges that enterprises are going to face. Now, there are global factors that are also adding to this complexity, right? So we are seeing, because of the COVID situation, people working from home, the remote and mobile workforce, and because they're working from home, it's very, very important that the endpoints that they use, they need to be secure. We are seeing also this whole issue regarding skills gap. Today, as per some reports, there is a shortage of almost 2 to 3 million cybersecurity professionals in India, right? So the need is there for enterprises to recruit people with the cybersecurity skills, but there's just not enough supply today. That's a big challenge today. Then the other issue is the divergence in the regulations, environment and geography, right? So every country has its regulations around data. Where is data being stored? How is it getting processed? How is data privacy being ensured? Right? So, like for example, Europe, you have GDPR. India, there is a parliament, which is actually the Joint Parliamentary Committee is actually reviewing the Personal Data Protection Bill. So regulations vary from country to country. If you talk from an IoT standpoint, there are some countries where it is mandatory for a device, an IoT device, to adopt what is called security by design principle. In India, it's just a guideline, right? So each country has its own, regulations. The cyber security investment optimization and risk mitigation. See, one thing which I wanted to very clearly tell you all is that no organization can ever claim that their network is 100% secure. Nobody can ever claim that, because cybersecurity is all about how you manage risk, right? There's always some loophole somewhere somebody can exploit, right? So it's all about how do you manage that risk, how do you mitigate that risk. And also, it's very important that you shouldn't be treating investment in cybersecurity tools and processes and people as a cost. This is mandatory for businesses today. The other thing that is playing out is this whole digital transformation, right? Especially in the last 18 months, we started to see a lot more companies adopt cloud. They have moved a lot of their applications and workloads to the cloud, right? And digital transformation is only going to grow going forward. And what clearly emerged from the COVID situation is that those enterprises who were very early in their journey or had not started their digital transformation journey were very, very badly affected. And those companies who are very mature were very, very less impacted. So there were many companies who did really well, especially those who were very mature in the digital transformation journey. And then, of course, increased cybercrime and threats by determined adversaries. So what organizations have realized is that fighting cybercrime is not their core competency, right? So you have a retail business, you have a manufacturing business, you have a bank. Their business is to provide services to their customers. The manufacturing companies to make good products and services for their customers. Cybercrime is not their core competence, and that's why they need help. Now, the questions that one need to answer: how do we address this whole digital risk? How do we support business continuity? And COVID was COVID created situations where companies had challenges in terms of how they could, manage their business continuity. And the question is, how are we able to adapt? And so the need is now for adopting security as a business imperative. It is a business imperative. It is to be taken at the CEO level. It has to be discussed at the board level. It is a business imperative. Now, quickly talking about Secure Access Service Edge, it's pronounced as SASE. Okay, now before I talk about SASE, let me very briefly talk to you about a typical enterprise network. How does it look like today, right? So you have a headquarter, you have a number of branches which are connecting to the headquarter through VPNs. You could have private VPNs which run on a private IP network through which you can route your traffic to the headquarters. You could also use internet-based VPNs and run SSL over it. And there are also enterprises who have data centers in which they store some of the applications there, right? So typically, this is how a static network would look like, right? A very finite network parameter. But there is complexity here. For example, every branch, if they want to access the corporate applications, they have to connect to the headquarter, right? If a branch wants to communicate to another branch, all the traffic has to be routed through the headquarters. So that leads to higher latency. And the OpEx, operational technology costs, are also very high here. Not very flexible. And then, of course, security is a big challenge here, because every branch you need to make sure that you have all the assets inside that branch secure. The headquarters, obviously, you got to make sure that you have the right security tools, etc. Now, what are the other challenges that are driving the shift to software-centric networking and security? And let me take a minute to talk about this whole aspect of software-defined networking, because if you just look at networking today, all the networking devices that are used today in any enterprise, be it large routers and switches. Now, in the past, all the routing functionality, the control functionality was all embedded in the hardware, right? So now what we're seeing is this whole aspect of software-defined networking, where you're trying to disaggregate the hardware from the software. So what we are seeing now is that enterprises are adopting commodity hardware, very simple hardware on which they run virtual functions, and all the orchestration and control is done remotely through software, right? So we're seeing that play out. So software-centric networking. And we're also using things like software-defined security, because again, in security, you're dealing with humongous amount of data. So you need software-based control and access. Now, the adoption of SaaS and cloud-based applications, I told you about that previously. Even SaaS, so a lot of enterprises, especially the small and medium enterprises, they are adopting SaaS in a big way. In fact, just a couple of days back, I was reading a report in Economic Times which talked about the Indian SaaS companies. A lot of the SaaS companies are from India, and the total revenue that is expected from these SaaS companies in the next 5 years is estimated to be around $75 billion. And they're expecting their market cap to be about $1 trillion in the next 7 to 8 years, right? So you're going to see a lot more adoption of SaaS and cloud-based applications. And what is also interesting is that these applications are not in the data center. They're now moved to the cloud, right? And just look at the COVID situation, right? So all of us working from home. So enterprises have also moved a lot of the enterprise applications to the cloud, and we are accessing all those applications on the cloud from any device, right? The workforce has become distributed, right? So you can work from anywhere you want to, from any device. And data is also scattered across multiple locations. You still have some data in the data center, you have data in the cloud, you have some of your endpoints which also store all the data, right? So data is kind of scattered across multiple locations. Now let me get to SASE now, and this is an architecture or a framework which Gartner had coined, and SASE combines wide area networking technology, with network security functions to support the dynamic nature of today's modern and mobile workforce. So today's workforce is modern. You're wanting to use any device to connect to an enterprise application. They are mobile, right? So it's a combination of networking and security. So this whole convergence between networking and security is happening. And that is what SASE is. Now, what are the key principles of SASE? The first thing is that data center is no longer the center of the network, right? So all legacy architectures are all built with data centers at the center. That's no longer the case now, with most of the applications moving to cloud, right? Then the access to application, the data should be based on identity and not the location, right? So if a user wants to access an application, and I'm going to touch upon zero trust access a little later, but the whole access is going to be based on the identity and on the context in which an access is required to an application. The users and applications are more distributed than before. And there are a number of vendors today who are offering SASE technology. And of course, we are going to see this whole consolidation happening. In fact, when I'm talking about networking and security convergence, we started to see many of the networking vendors trying to acquire security companies, and the other way around also, security companies trying to acquire networking vendors. For example, Palo Alto Networks, well known in the security space, they have acquired a company called CloudGenix, very strong in SD-WAN technology, software-defined WAN technology. Now, looking at the Gartner hype cycle, and I think all of you know what the Gartner hype cycle is, but every technology, when enterprises adopt a technology, it goes through a curve, right? So initially adoption is low, and then you get to a stage where there's a lot of expectations on users in terms of the benefit of the technology. And then you get to a stage where you're disillusioned. It goes through that trough of disillusionment. And then it kind of plateaus into a steady state deployment. And today SASE is, if you see on the left side, the green box there, it's right below there. So the innovation trigger is very strong. And we're probably going to see a lot of enterprises definitely consider SASE going forward. Now, why is SASE a buzzword for 2021? Because the main point being that it is a model where the cloud and mobile are the center of attention, right? So this whole convergence between mobile and cloud has happened. And it is delivered as a cloud-based service. So all the control, everything is orchestration, everything is done from the cloud. And policy-based software-defined secure access. So you have policies that are there which will allow a user to access a specific application, right? Everything is software-defined. And then you can precisely specify the level of performance, etc. So just wanted to give you some examples here. For example, if a user wants to access Microsoft 365, which is hosted on the cloud, it will determine the path selection, which path it should take. Should it go via an internet or via a private network? You got to maintain quality of service because it's an enterprise application. You got to get that good level of performance. You can accelerate the application, and you may not need to do an inspection of this because this is a proven enterprise application. Now, if a user wants to access Facebook, say, through the same network, and of course you can determine which path that you want to take. You might also want to implement quality of service, but then you can restrict certain features. You may not want to allow, say, video calling using the enterprise network. You might also want to do some inspection of chat sessions, right? So each application is treated differently. So Salesforce, again, widely used CRM application, the data loss prevention monitoring, malware inspection can be done. And if it's personal banking, if you're trying to use your enterprise network for personal banking, those transactions are not monitored at all, right? So this is how it works. Now, what are the drivers for SASE? And I've listed about six here. Now, if you start with the left, the connectivity needs are constantly changing today, right? So for an enterprise, the option to use internet as a transport to connect to the corporate network is always there, and that will continue. MPLS, multi-protocol label switching, which is used for private VPNs, where you use a private network, you bypass the internet. That has always been there. That might even continue. You might use even high-speed network like 5G, which probably take a year or so before you get that in India. LTE is 4G. So the connectivity needs keep changing. And what is really important is for a company to look at a hybrid approach, because there's never a one-size-fits-all. You might have to use a combination of technology. You might use a combination of internet and MPLS perhaps. Second thing is this whole centralized model today is not going to meet the distributed needs, right? So as I mentioned, data is distributed, users are distributed. And if you're going to have a centralized model where you're having your on-prem DLP, your VPN gateway, your firewall on-prem, and all the security controls all confined to a centralized model, then that's not going to work, right? It has to be distributed. Third is the sanctioned and unsanctioned cloud apps. So today, while most often than not, the CIOs take the decisions in terms of what cloud apps to procure. Of course, you can, buy it as a service. But then what is also happening is this whole concept of shadow IT, where some of the other functions, for example, the chief marketing officer might find a very interesting SaaS application, and he might just go and buy it without the CEO knowing about it. So this is an example of an unsanctioned cloud apps. It's also very hard to keep up with the malicious actors, right? So, as I mentioned earlier, that, security is not the core competency of an organization. So you really need to have people with the skills to be able to handle your security. Next is the fifth point, mobile with managed and unmanaged devices. Now you have your mobile assets. It could be your smartphones, it could be your tablets, your PCs, laptops. You also have IoT, right? So with the IoT growing, a lot of these IoT devices are now connecting to the internet, and these IoT devices connect to pretty much any physical asset. As I said, machine, a car, any consumer appliance, a truck, and what have you, right? So now with all these IoT endpoints connecting, managing that becomes a challenge. And then this work from home has become the new enterprise edge, right? So I talked to you about edge. So now with people working from home, each one has got his own profile, right? And they need direct access to cloud apps. So all these are kind of drivers which are pushing enterprise to seriously consider SASE. And let me talk to you about the framework of SASE, okay? The first thing is that it's a software-defined wide area network. When I say SD-WAN, here what you're doing is you're using internet as the means for transport to connect to the corporate applications, which could be on the cloud. And what is also happening is that this whole WAN virtualization, and you would have heard of the term virtualization earlier, right? VMware was the pioneer in starting virtualization, where instead of having hundreds of physical servers, you could have one server and you could have multiple VMs, virtual machines running on a single piece of hardware. The same thing is playing out in the WAN space, where you could have commodity hardware, routers with very, very low cost and running virtual software functions over it, right? So this whole WAN virtualization. Traffic management, right? So in a software-defined network, you could, do application awareness. You can set policies which will determine which applications get higher priority compared to the other applications, and so on and so forth. So SD-WAN is one very important part of it. Second is firewall as a service. So normally the firewall is hosted in the enterprise, right, in their own premises. But now what we started to see is a lot more enterprises using firewall on the cloud, right? So all the filtering, all that policy, all that is done in the cloud itself. Again, it's application awareness, so your intrusion detection system, your prevention system, they're all hosted on the cloud. Your anti-malware, everything is hosted on the cloud. Then we have the zero trust network access. And here I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about zero trust network access, because that's a very, very important dimension as it relates to SASE. So it works on the principle that you never trust anyone, as the name indicates. You always verify, and you trust nothing, and you challenge everything. So the focus is more on users, the assets, and the resources that the users want to access, right? So trust is not granted implicitly, but must be continuously evaluated. So it's a very dynamic thing, right? And access to individual resources is granted on a per session basis. It's not like you just connect to an enterprise intranet and pretty much access all the applications. Access is given session by session, right? So your identity of the user is constantly checked. So here, the key components are identity and access management. You also use multi-factor authentication. all of us use it. We use a password and then we get an OTP on our phone. The same thing would play out in the enterprise as well. And of course, the data which is going on that is encrypted. And it works on what is called the least privilege principle, which means that it provides what users need only for that moment, right? So that's what it is. Then you have the secure web gateway, where you do the URL filtering, preventing access to sites which your employees might not need to have, SSL inspection, your DNS monitoring on that. So your secure web gateway, and then of course the cloud access security broker, which sits between the user and the cloud applications, right? So your policies are set, and then you determine which user can access which cloud application, right? So the CSB, as they call it. So broadly, these are the technologies that come into play when it comes to SASE framework. Now, you put all this together, and as you see in this diagram, you have your network. You can use SD-WAN, you can use broadband, internet. Then you have this firewall as a service, number 2. Then you have the secure web gateway, number 3, and then you have your CSB, and then you have zero trust network access, right? So you kind of combine all of this into a framework, and then you see this here. Now, what are the benefits that a customer might get when you are actually combining SD-WAN and security and you're delivering it from an edge cloud? So you have these SASE POPs, which are, to which you have the branches connected to, the small offices connected to, the mobile users connected to, IoT connected to. It acts like the bridge between all these endpoints and the network. So the benefits that a customer would get, the performance is much, much better there. It is completely optimized from a latency standpoint, reduces the number of hops. Ease of use, access experience is much, much better. Complexity and costs are reduced. There's no OpEx here. The OpEx is considerably reduced. You really don't need too many people and expertise, to manage this. You're enabling zero trust network access, and then finally you're, improving the security by, monitoring the content continuously. Now, if you just look at the modern enterprise today, typically this is what it is. Again, just a reinforcement of my earlier, slides in terms of how a network would look like. Any kind of network option that one can choose. You have the application on the right side. You have, the cloud. You could use any cloud that you want. And then what is also interesting is there's some studies which are done that shows that a lot of the organizations today are operating in a multi-cloud environment today, right? And a lot of these enterprises, like 40% of enterprises, as per a study, is going to adopt SASE, right? So this is how the modern enterprise would look like. Now, how is the future of how is the network of the future going to look like? Just look at this. So on the left side, you have all your work from home devices, your mobile devices, your branch devices, etc. And they're all connecting, right, through a network. It could be VPN, could be internet, Wi-Fi, 5G, and then you have the edge. I told you about the edge, which is sitting between the cloud and your endpoints, right? So somewhere in between. And then you have, your zero trust network access, your SASE in the blue circles. Those come into play here. And then if you just look at the whole orchestrator, the whole security, that's all in the cloud, security as a service. So companies would use network as a service, and they would also use security as a service, right? So your CASP, your secure web gateway, your DLP, your sandboxing is all in the cloud here, right? And that acts as a gateway to all your cloud applications or any of your enterprise applications on the right side, right? So the whole approach is going to be pure cloud, internet-based, directly connecting to cloud. Your branches will be much, much lighter because you don't need to implement security in your branches. You don't need firewall in your branches because you're moving security to the cloud. Your network as a service will mature, security as a service will mature. And then you're also going to introduce identity context into the network. And what is this going to bring? It's going to bring much, much lower cost. You really don't have to have too many people to manage this. You can access pretty much any application using internet or wireless. The security is on the cloud, and some of that will be on the edge. And you're actually using a cloud backbone for enterprise connectivity. Now, very quickly, I just wanted to touch upon cloud security, because this is on everybody's mind today, right? So a number of cloud security incidents have happened. Again, I'm just quoting some data points here from Oracle and KPMG as per a cloud threat report. 41% enterprises have a dedicated cloud security architect. So obviously, the need for more security architects, and this is actually going to throw open a lot more job opportunities, right? So I'm not going to go through all this, but I just want to make a point that this is something which is very, very critical. And when you talk about cloud security, it is a shared responsibility, right? So just because an enterprise moves applications to the cloud, it doesn't mean that the whole security of those applications rest with the cloud service provider. There is a shared responsibility. So, again, a survey was done which showed that 82% of cloud users have experienced security events due to confusion about who owns what, right? So you have different models of cloud, right? So you have software as a service, you have platform as a service, and then you have infrastructure as a service, right? So I think what is very, very important is for any enterprise before they move any of their applications to the cloud to really figure out whose responsibility is whom, who's going to be responsible for what. I think that becomes very, very important. It is always going to be a shared responsibility. And then, the whole cloud inventory and the assessment that you constantly need to do, because see, security is always going to be a journey, right? You just cannot say that, okay, I've secured all my endpoints, I've secured my application in the cloud. It's something which is constantly evolving, right? You constantly have to monitor new threats which are coming in, right? So you need to have your visibility in all your public clouds. I told you, studies have shown that many of them are using multi-clouds, right? So you need to constantly view your instances, your access control list, users, etc. You're monitoring the assessment and and you're identifying the threats which are coming from misconfigurations. In fact, another study has shown that a lot of the security issues occur because of misconfiguration. You don't secure, your policies are not properly set, and there are reasons. And the whole cloud security, there are about 4 or 5 threats that came. So one is the misconfigured cloud services. Then it's data loss, and then the API vulnerabilities. As you know, for applications to talk to each other, you use APIs. So there might be vulnerabilities there. There could be malware infections, and then of course access management controls as well. So the need is to constantly get those insights and to prioritize the threats, and that's where I think the power of AI would come in, because with AI you're able to manage so much of data, and then of course you can build your machine learning models to get to a stage where you can actually predict when a threat might occur. I just want to end by talking about this whole security first mindset here, right? So I think first and foremost is for an organization to tie security to business objectives and outcome. They should not treat security as a separate function. It has to be tied to business objectives, because if an enterprise gets, if any of the networks get compromised for whatever reason, then the damage to their brand, it takes a long time to regain the trust from customers, right? If I know that a bank that I'm banking with, if their banking systems have been hacked, kind of erodes the trust, right? So it takes a hell of a long time for banks to build the trust back again, or for that matter, any enterprise. Second thing is to move away from ROI metrics. You cannot treat security investment as, okay, if I'm investing $1 million in security, when am I going to get ROI? I think that mindset has to change completely. You've got to ensure that you invest security, whatever it costs. The shared responsibility model for employees, I think that is also very important, because a lot of the threats happen also because of insider threats, right? So some of the employees might be, using the network fraudulently or injecting malicious software inside, right? So there might be some very disgruntled employees who might be doing that. So I think what is also needed is to make sure that employees are aware in terms of what are the do's and don'ts. This whole aspect of security hygiene, right? Set the tone at the top. I think, as I mentioned, security today is a boardroom discussion, right? The CEO today, many of the CISOs, the Chief Information Security Officers, they don't report to the CIO, they report directly to the CEO. And I think the need is to constantly assess risks for business adaptability, right? As I mentioned earlier, how do you, manage that risk? That becomes very, very important. So, friends, with this, I close, and I'm happy to take questions.
Yeah, he's ready with the question. Hello, Mr. Sunil David. That was a wonderful session. So we have the questions, and I'll read it out for you. What are the key challenges going forward, considering the evolving attack surfaces and threats to physical safety?
Yeah, so I gave the example of a drone attack, right? So today, government is actually working on a drone policy where you can use drones today to deliver medicines at very remote locations or vaccines at remote locations. Drones can be used to do site surveys. Drones can be used in agriculture to take pictures of crops and all that. Now imagine if and these drones are all connected to the internet. The whole control of the drones happens, remotely.
Yeah.
If the drone gets compromised for whatever reason, can you imagine the damage it might cause, right? So if the hacker might hack that drone, and it might also ensure that it targets maybe some individual or a house, then then it's physical harm to that person, right? So even in an industrial environment, a lot of industrial equipment is used, and especially in some of the large industrial environments, we're using boilers, and some of these are also connected to the internet thanks to IoT. And if you're hacking into that, and if there are people working around it, it might actually, it might cause physical harm to that person. Or a connected car connected cars today. Cars are also connected to the internet. If a hacker is able to hack into the car, then he can actually control the steering, right? So that impacts his driver safety. So there, I think, enough or more examples where if any of these assets gets compromised, that can definitely lead to, physical harm. Sumi.
All right. So we have our second question. How can small companies or organizations that do not have the cybercrime defense capabilities secure themselves against cyber attacks?
So I think what I wanted to advise all the small and medium enterprises is that there are a number of startups today in the security space. Some of them have very, very good solutions, right? So I think, and many of these startups are also very flexible. They've come up with some very good cost-effective solutions, right? And as I mentioned, today a lot of the security can be on the cloud, right? So of course there might be a need for some endpoint security or some security on your enterprise, but I think it will be good to engage with some of these startups who have some really cool solutions, where they talk about endpoint security or a network security or applications or data security. So I think it all starts with doing your vulnerability assessment and your penetration testing. First, you need to assess where the vulnerability is in your enterprise. And today there are many who can do this VAPT, as they call it, vulnerability assessment and penetration testing. Enterprises have to see, small companies have to see where the vulnerabilities are, and then try to plug those. And it's always going to be a journey. You constantly have to assess your risk and then work.
All right. So our final and last question is: when a company wants to adopt SASE, what criteria should be the focus for choosing the right third-party vendor?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the third-party vendor ideally, should be someone who can offer both the connectivity as well as the security solution. And when I say connectivity, it is largely the telecom service providers. I think they are well positioned to provide a really seamless, integrated solution which combines connectivity, the transport, securing the transport, as well as providing the SASE framework. So your best bet would be to work with the telecom providers who have solutions which will combine both, rather than somebody who just provides the hardware. Sumi.
Okay, Mr. Sunil, and that's it for the day. And we usually enjoy the way you speak, and you bring a lot of insight into the intelligent way of bringing us, sharing us with a lot of information. So we are done with your session, and we are very thankful for the session, sir.
Thank you, Sumi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rocheston team, for inviting me. Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye.